G'day comrades, welcome to the Mind in 1500 Words, Season 3, Episode 6. Trainor and Desjardins, 2002, pitch characteristics of infant-directed speech affect infants' ability to discriminate vowels, in Psychonomic Bulletin and Review, Volume 9, Issue 2, page 335 to 340. Welcome back everybody. I hope those of you in the Southern Hemisphere have enjoyed your summer break and that everyone has managed to stay safe and have a somewhat tolerable lockdown. You join us today in the middle of Season 3, where our focus has been on developmental psychology. This week we're looking at first verbal language learning. We begin to learn language as infants, of course. Given how hard it is to learn a language and how important it is perhaps not surprising that adults naturally try to make it easier for infants to learn to talk. We see this in what is called infant-directed speech, or sometimes child-directed speech, or motherese, because why care about fathers or anyone else who interacts with babies? Okay. Infant-directed speech tends to be higher in pitch and involve more pitch variation than speech directed towards adults or older children. It is naturally occurring in the sense that no one has to teach you how to talk to a baby, you just do it. It occurs across cultures, even amongst those speaking tonal languages such as Mandarin, and has analogues in sign language, where adults naturally use slower and more exaggerated signs when talking to infants. In reading about this in a typical textbook, you might come across a claim like this. Quote, "The use of child-directed speech makes it easier for infants to make a number of important speech discriminations. The exaggerated intonation of child-directed speech and longer pauses between words also facilitates speech segmentation and discrimination between vowel sounds." End quote. Should you believe this? Well, the Trainor and Desjardins is given as the reference here, so that's a good place to start. When we turn to it, we see that it is only about one of the claims made in the quote. Trainor and Desjardins' study doesn't touch on long pauses and the splitting of speech into syllables and words. It is only about tone and discriminating vowel sounds. That's okay, one thing at a time, but just keep in mind how narrow our focus is here. When Trainor and Desjardins published this study in 2002, there was broad consensus that the way adults speak to infants is designed to enhance learning. That said, there were some questions left around whether or not it was necessary, i.e. whether or not infants can learn language from speech that lacks big fluctuations in pitch. Still, Trainor and Desjardins were happy to accept that fluctuations in pitch make it easier to discriminate vowel sounds. There were a couple of issues, however. Previous research suggested that using high pitches made it harder to discriminate vowels. And whilst infant-directed speech involves a lot of pitch fluctuation, which should make learning easier, it also involves a lot of high-pitched talking, which should make learning harder. Furthermore, just because pitch fluctuations should make it easier to discriminate vowels, it doesn't follow from this that infants are able to make use of this difference. Trainor and Desjardins approached these issues by asking whether or not variations in pitch and how much pitch fluctuates make a difference to whether babies can discriminate vowels. They tested 96 infants on a vowel discrimination task using two vowels, E as in heed and I as in hid. If you find it easy to hear the difference between these vowels, it's only because you're so well practiced with them. It is difficult to learn the difference between these sounds, and it can be something that people with some forms of dyslexia, for example, struggle with for a long time. Trainor and Desjardins created 4 variants of each of these vowel sounds. A low-pitched version, more like a typical female speaking to adult voice, and a high-pitched version, more like a typical female speaking to an infant voice, to answer questions about whether pitch makes a difference. And 2 versions with exaggerated variance in pitch modelled on infant-directed speech. One of these started relatively high and went down. The other started relatively low and also went down. The infants first learned that when they heard one of the vowels, either E or I, that if they turned their head, they would get to see a toy they liked flash and move. Babies were understood to discriminate between the sounds if they turned towards the toy when they hear the target sound, but not the other one. After learning, the infants are exposed to one sound, say I, every 2 seconds. In the experimental condition, once in a sequence, the target sound, in this case E, would play instead. Infants are deemed to discriminate the sounds if on hearing E, in this case, they turn towards the toy. This was repeated for each of the 4 versions of the sound, the high and low pitch versions, as well as the 2 descending pitch versions. From the number of times infants turned their head to the target sound, Trainor and Desjardins computed a statistic called D', which is a common measure of how well subjects discriminated between stimuli for each infant. These scores were then entered into an analysis called an ANOVA, which determined if there was likely to be a difference in the D' scores, depending on if the pitch was relatively high or low, whether it was constant or descending, and some demographics. This showed there was a better than 99.5% chance that infants were better at discriminating low-pitched vowel sounds than high-pitched vowel sounds, regardless of whether or not the pitch was consistent or if it was descending. Further to this, there was a better than 99.99% chance that infants were better at discriminating vowels when the pitch of the speech was descending than when it was flat, regardless of whether it was relatively high or low. Further, the infant's performance was better than chance, i.e. they weren't just guessing when the toy would appear, except when the vowel sounds were high in pitch and the pitch was flat. This suggests that they could not hear the difference between E and I in that condition. We have then very strong evidence that variance in pitch during a vowel sound helps babies distinguish between E and I. Further, there is strong evidence that if pitch is consistent and relatively high, infants don't distinguish between these 2 vowel sounds. Trainor and Desjardins interpret this as suggesting that high-pitched vowel sounds sound more similar to babies than low-pitched sounds, something that seems to be confirmed by an additional analysis which suggested a 99% chance that infants did better when the pitch was relatively low and descending than relatively high and descending. We have good evidence that fluctuating pitch helps infants discriminate between vowel sounds, which should in turn help with understanding spoken language. The exaggerated variance in pitch typical of infant-directed speech thus should help infants learn to understand spoken sounds by helping them learn to discriminate vowel sound. But there's an issue here. Infant-directed speech is also typically relatively high in pitch, whilst people rarely speak with no pitch variation, so we're unlikely to get a context where infants don't distinguish the vowel sounds. There is still evidence that high pitch makes things harder for infants than it could be. So why do we talk to infants in high voices? Trainor and Desjardins suggest that we gain something else from speaking in high tones. High tones, they argue, are commonly used to signal positive emotion, whereas low tones are used to signal aggression. Thus, infant-directed speech involves a trade-off between helping infants discriminate vowel sounds and presenting them with positive emotion. But of course, we'd need to look at other evidence to work out if that is likely to be true. That said, there is good evidence here that the way we fluctuate pitch when talking to babies does help them discriminate vowel sounds, and it seems likely that this helps in learning to understand spoken language. Thanks for joining us today. Next time will be a paper in the New Papers in Consciousness Studies series. 1399.